Okay, guys, I think we can start. So, hello. I hope you had a great weekend. And today we're going to talk about ACLs and import and export of entities. First, of course, I'm going to recap what we did on last week. And I'm going to remind you the training process. So when you can ask questions and when do we have some breaks. And then we'll talk about the practice session from the last week theory. And then we're going to start with today's topic. Okay, so please let me start sharing the screen. Of course, if you have some questions, you can use chat anytime. Sure. Okay, so the training process, just to remind you, we're gonna talk about the ORO fundamentals. I will try to show you as many examples as possible. Some of them will be in the UI, some of them will be in the IDE. At the end of each topic, there will be short question and answer session. It will be only for immediate questions. So if I will be not able to answer immediately, I will ask you to post this question to the Slack channel, or we can postpone it and talk about it on the last day when we're gonna have a longer Q&A session. And we're gonna have one 15-minute break today, just between the topics. Of course, slides and the recording will be emailed to you right after the webinar. And there is a Slack channel created especially for this webinar. If you have any questions or any issues, you can post them right then, and we'll try to help you as soon as possible. And I will just add this link to our chat. Let me just find it. Chat. And if you have any issues or you want to discuss something, you can use chat. If you have any questions, please use question and answer tab. It's just easier because I can track which questions have been answered or which still needs my attention. Okay, so last week we talked about the development environment. We talked how to configure it, what plugins do we recommend to install, what folders should be indexed and which shouldn't. Then we talk about general concepts, so why ORO exists, why we needed it, why we extended Symfony, what products do we have, and some of the best practices we recommend and we follow. And then we talked about how to customize it, so there are some Symfony ways and some that are more ORO specific. And we covered quite big topic about entities and their data and anything related to them. So anything we can do with the data, how we handle it, how we index, how we search. And at the very end, we had a practice, not like session, but I showed you an exercise. And right now I will show you and explain the solution of this exercise. Right after this, we're gonna talk about the ACLs in ORO, and I will show you exercise with the solution. Then we're gonna have short question and answer session and the break. And after the break, we're gonna talk about import and export. And again, I will show you the practice and the solution today, because tomorrow we have 3 topics to cover, so we will not probably have time to start from the practice exercise at the beginning. Okay, so let me start. Let me just make it full screen. And I will open trainings application in second tab. So this you've already seen. So we created the new entity. We created installer and immigration for this. We created relation using extended extension. And we loaded fixtures. Okay, so right after this, you should be able to go to your application. And for example, if you go to the user view page, because of the extended functionality and owner custom, it was automatically added to your entity. So here on the view page, I can see that I have username tab assigned for this specific user. And on the edit page, I have the the form extended with additional field, which is actually a drop-down for those naming types that I've loaded through the fixtures. Okay, right now, the second part of the practice was mostly about using those information in specific places. So, first of all, we should fix the provider decorator. So, at the first day, we decorated the name provider and hard-coded the condition. If the entity is instance of user, we return the hard-coded format. Of course, this is not a good practice, but this was just example and just a beginning of the exercise. Right now, since we already have the possibility to define the relation for specific user, we should check it and use it for the name generation. So this is my provider, and here I had the condition that was hard-coded. Right now, I'm checking if the instance is a user. Please be sure that you are not calling getNamingType before you check if this is user entity or not. Otherwise, you may have 500 errors because you will be trying to execute this method on other entities which doesn't have it. Okay, so once you check if this is user or not, you should get the naming type, and this method is generated for you in the cache because you created this extended relation. So once again, we could open var cache or entities extend entity. Here, searching is really useful. So I'm searching for user, and with the arrows, I can navigate between the classes. And here I have oro user role and oro user. So here I have naming type property, and for the naming type property, I have getter and setter. Okay, so right now I can use this as it would be part of my entity, just as any other method or property I have in the entity. So let's go back here, just a second. Okay, and I'm checking if there is naming type, I'm using it. We're gonna talk about this in a moment. Otherwise, I'm returning the original provider getName functionality. So because we're gonna use this name providing in few places, here we started from creating a full name provider service, which is something very simple. It takes the entity, it takes the format, and returns the name in the specific format for this given entity. So to create a service, I just created a simple class user full name provider, and it is loaded automatically with auto wiring and auto configure. As you can see, I have auto configure set to true, and I have defined the resources to where it should look for the classes, and I do not have any declaration for this user full name provider. It was automatically created. And here I have very simple method, get full name. It takes user entity and some format, and it uses strtr php method, which actually gets this format and replaces all occurrences of those specific keys with those values, right? So this is like string replace on array. So I'm passing the user and format, and based on this, it returns the text representation for this entity. Next, we should create index page. So we start to create our CRUD. As I said, it's gonna be simplified. So we only have index and view pages. We will not have edit or create page, and delete action will be provided automatically because of those actions we discussed last week. So to create a controller, I have the controller directory. I have the username in controller class. And here I create an action. So I start from the index action. Here I just pass the entity class that it's gonna be represented in this specific action. So it's usernaming type. I need to register this controller in routing YAM. So I create routing YAM file inside resources config or directory. It's gonna be automatically discovered. I don't have to register it anywhere. I point to specific controller. If you have everything configured properly, you should be able to check if this is correct controller by clicking it. And also, as I remember, you should have hints here. Then we use annotation for the controllers always, and I can have prefix here, or if I preferred, I could also define the prefix here as a class annotation. Then for the index action, as we talked, usually it's an action without any parameters, so I have just route. I have name. I'm using the default template path, so I don't need to specify the template here. And I need to create, of course, the template myself. So I create this template under resources view usernaming index.html.twig. And as you remember, I extend default index action from Oro UI bundle and just set the grid name and the page title. Okay, so this is created action control already, but to be able to see it, of course, I would need to add it menu item for it. So I create navigation YAM in my bundle in resources config Oro, again auto discovered. Here I have menu config, and inside I have items and tree. In items, I create just one item. I add some label to it, a specific route, a position, and extras. So those routes will also trigger this item to be highlighted, right? So when I'm gonna click this item, I'm gonna be taken to this route. But if application will be on any or those additional routes, it's still gonna highlight this specific item. And then I add it to the application menu. So I specify the which menu, and I specify the hierarchy structure. So it's in the system tab under user management section. It's displaying this item. Okay, so I have the item, and this is this name. So right now, if I go to the UI of the application, I should be able to go to system, user management, and here I have user naming types. Okay, so to make it look like this, of course, I need to create this data grid I specified in the index template. So here I created the data grid, and this is just a name, so I need to create this data grid. For this, I create data grid YAML inside the resources config Oro directory. There is a namespace data grids. Then I have the name, and I configure whole data grid. Usually you want to extend entity that you are going to display, because thanks to this, you will display the dynamic fields that you created by the migrations. Otherwise, you will need to add them by yourself. In most cases, in backend, you're going to use ORM as a data source. For the front store, you can, for example, for products, you're going to use search. So we are displaying them from the index, not from the database. Then you define the query that is going to be used for this specific data grid. So you define from which table and which columns should be selected. This is very simple listing, so I don't need any joins. Then we specify the columns, the properties, which always need ID just to generate the view link. So I have the ID, which, as you see, there's a tilde here, so it points to the ID from the select. And I have the view link, which is using this route. It's not yet created, and with this specific parameter from here. I can have some sorters, filters, and the action is actually just the view action, and it's row action true, which means that this is the action is going to be executed when I click on the data grid row. So once I have it, the grid should be displayed, but it will give me error because I do not have view page yet. Excuse me. So the next point is to create a simple view page and render the title, format, and grid of user who use this format. So this is something extra. Creating view page is very similar to creating the index page. So I have the view action, and I need ID in the route. So usually it's going to be view/ID. I have the route name, and I have the requirements. It depends what are your keys. Here we have IDs that are numeric, so I have regex for digit. And again, I have the template. template is a little bit more complex than for the index. So we start from extending the default view page. We import data grids because we have this optional task. And then we define some blocks. So in content data, for example, we display the title, the format. And here we, for example, have include another template. So we had this full name example that we used in our listener. And right now we can also include it inside other templates. So we don't need to copy the code. We don't need to regenerate it. We just include other template in here. We set it to some property, and then we can display it as any other variable using the render HTML property macro. So this would handle the first two, so the title and the format with reuse of the template. Now, grid of the user who used this format. So here, I'm setting the related users variable, and inside I render the data grid. And what is very important here, I have the name, but also to have access to this specific format inside the template, I need to bind some variable. So I have naming type ID. This is the name of the variable from the data grid, and I bind the entity ID. Okay, so now let's go to data grid YAML. I should create this data grid there. It's here. The source, and this is the data grid that displays the users. So the source is user. And in the condition, I have where and naming type. And here I have some parameter. In bind parameters, I have that the name should be bound to naming type ID. Okay, so this is how I pass the variable from the view to the data grid, and thanks to this, I can do some conditions or where in the select. And now, if I go to the view page, if I have this official naming type assigned to any user, I will have it here in data grid. Okay, so this is a very good example how you can first render additional data grid in your view, and also bind some parameters from the view to your data grid, you see, as a specifying the second attribute for the rendered data grid macro. Then in data blocks, I pass two blocks actually. So the first one is general information that I have here, and it is displayed as the first tab, general information. And the second one is called related users, and in the blocks I pass this related users variable, which actually just have the data grid. So it's here. Again, for the view page and edit page, you need to remember to set this ID, otherwise you will have issue from this naming extension when it will try to dispatch the event for scroll data. Okay, another step. We should add view action to user naming type grid that will lead to the view page. So you've already seen this, but again, in data grid YAML, I have these actions, I have the view, and the link is just a property. So I have view link here, and here it is defined. So it defines the type, so it's URL, the route, and which params should be passed to this route. Okay, then we should add tweet extension to render the example of username based on a format. And it should be filter on function, and it should be added to the data grid. So you already seen it on the data grid, but it's here. As you can see, I have some example. It's using some dummy data because I do not have any user here. So it will just pass some fake user object that is not persisted just to generate example using this specific format. So first, how do we create tweak extension? You create a tweak directory. There you have extension, user naming extension, for example, and you extend the abstract extension from the tweak. Okay, thanks to this and thanks to the auto configure, I do not have to tag it as tweak extension, and I do not have to configure this service. You see, again, it will, if I go to the services, There is nothing about this user naming extension. If I would not use the auto wiring, I would need to create user naming extension, and I would have to tag it with tweak extension to work. Thanks to auto configure, it is automatically tagged because it extends this abstract extension from the tweak namespace. Also, it will automatically inject our full name provider here because we have the hint in constructor. Then we created get filters or get functions, independent which way you prefer. And I have the name, it's called full name example, and which method of this class should be called. So to this method, I'm passing the format. And this is a nice example how you can create entity without persisting and still use it. So I'm creating some dummy user, and I'm setting the name attributes, so name, prefix, first name, middle name, last name, and the suffix. And then using full name provider, I'm passing this entity, which is not yet persisted and will not be persisted, and the format that should be generated. Once I have it, I will be able to use this full name provider in Tweak. But we need to add it to the data grid. So in this case, we will go to the data grid YAML, found the column that we are looking for. So this is format, and change the type to Tweak, and the front end type to HTML, and define which template should be rendered inside of this data grid cell. So we create some template. Usually we're gonna put it in the entity directory, data grid, and name of the column, for example. So format column. Inside, to get the information, we have access to the record, and the record is the record of this data grid row. And I can get, for example, ID. So I'm displaying the type ID and the value, and below I'm generating the example. So I'm including this example. Again, it includes this, so I do not have to copy. Of course, I could just copy the content of this template, but instead I'm including the template and passing some information to it. So inside I will have access to the format from this data grid row. So I can go, and here I just display the format using Tweak extension full name example. Again, this should be clickable, and see, I'm passing the format, and thanks to this, I generate the example here, and reusing exactly the same Tweak template and Tweak extension on the view page. Okay, so I do not have to copy, I can reuse, which of course is better. Okay, so actually this is the second part, render example on the user view page, reusing the same template. Then the last thing is to make the user naming type searchable. As you remember, there are two search indexes. We're gonna talk only about the backend one, so Oro search index, and in the community edition is stored in database. So to make entity searchable, I should create search YAM in the resources config Oro directory. And the first, I have the search namespace. Then I pass fully qualified class name of this given entity. If you ever need to render, generate this FQCN, I can go to the entity, and here I can just click copy the reference, and it will give me this name just with the slash at the very beginning. Okay, so just a hint how to generate this. Then I specify alias. So this is just a search alias. How to create entity alias, you already seen in the theory in the last lesson, but also we're gonna talk about this tomorrow again. Then we have some title fields. I'm pretty sure that 4.1 is already not being used because we use name provider for this. We specified search template. I'm gonna show you this in a second. We specify route that's going to be used for the results, and we map some fields. Actually, all we want to add to the index is the naming type title, so that's what we do. The type is text. We have the title. Any index is gonna be called title. Okay, and the template looks like this. So I have access to two variables in those templates, entity and the indexer item. Of course, this annotation doesn't have to be copied to each template. We just left it here for your reference. So if I'm using entity, I'm gonna use the entity from the database. If I'm using indexer items, I have access to those properties that were indexed and stored. And in most cases, you will extend the Oro search result item template, and then just, for example, specify if you should show email, how to generate the title, and what should be displayed in the entity info. Here we had only the title, so this is what we display. Once you have this, you should, for example, edit or run a search reindex command, and then on the UI, you should see your naming types in the search. So I can type for official. First of all, I have some quick results here, but I can click search and I will have it full results. So the link here is the route I have specified in the search YAML, and the template that is used to generate this bar is used from this template, also defined there. Also, I can narrow down my search here and specify the entity in this place. Usernaming type, and then actually it will give me the same result, but I will be taken to this specific tab immediately. So if I will have results for official in different entities, I will be first displayed the entities that I looked for. Okay, guys, do you have any questions to this solution? Maybe do you have some other ideas, or maybe one of you tried to do this and did it in other way? I see I have one question in Q&A. Oh, Max Perry, if you executed your migration and the migration ran without any issues, get naming type have to be there. If it is not, you can execute comments. Just a second. Let me just prepare. So if you are not sure what comment is this, you can always go to your console and type. So it would be bin/console and then grep for extend or for entity maybe. And I have some comments, as you can see, with additional information. And the one I would be looking for, it would be entity extend update schema. If my migration was failed, maybe it was failed here. And then entity extend cache clear error map. Okay, so this should be it. And if the relation was created properly, the cache should be generated. If not, I would restore database dump that you should create before running the migration. I would recheck the migration, correct if there are any mistakes, and then execute this again. Because if the relation is, migration is written properly, if this is extend, and there is an extend to true and the owner, the cache should be generated and there should be a property and the getter and setter methods. Okay, there is no more question. So just a second and we're gonna go with the ACLs. Oh, here I will switch to the next branch of the repository, so you will see the parts of the tickets already created of the practice. So and I will just remove the cache. Okay, let's refresh and let's go with the next topic. So security and access control list, really important because most of the entities you would like to properly secure, so nobody who shouldn't will not be able to see it or access any data, for sure modify it, right? So we are strongly based on the Symfony solution, so ACLs for this. Excuse me, wrong button. So first of all, permissions are always assigned to user roles, never to specific users. So if I need to assign something very specific to a specific user, House creates a new role for this user, assign it to it, and this is how you can proceed. Each user has one or more roles. Users are logically grouped in the business units. Business units have some hierarchy, and they relate to the organization. So first, let's see it in the application. Here I have the system, I have the organization. Because this is community, there's only one. If this will be enterprise, I will show you this on demo. There will be many. No, it's not yet loaded. Okay, here I will have organizations and I have some index, and here I can pick the organization in which scope I would like to work at this specific moment. In Community Edition, there is only one organization, so it's one scope less. We're gonna talk about it in a second. Then I have some business units, and the business units also relate to each other. So here I have, for example, ACME General, and it doesn't have owner, so this is like the main business unit. And I have two additional subsidiary business units, ACME East and ACME West. As you can see, they have owner, so they are subsidiaries of the general business unit, okay? And also, I have roles. The important part to understand here that we have roles that are separate for the front end and for the backend for the application. It's the same as we have for the users. So when we talk about backend users, we have them here. Those are users of the management console, and they have backend roles here. We are not going to talk about the front store users. They're going to be covered in the commerce webinar, but they are placed here. So I have customer users. Those are users that can log in to the front store, so your clients, and they have different roles with different permissions. Okay, so this is very important. Today we're going to cover on the security of the backend of the application. The concepts are exactly the same for the front store, but they are using different entities to keep those, okay? So here I have the roles, and I have the list of the roles. If I go to some role, there's a view or edit page. I have huge list of the permissions to specific entities. As you can see, for each entity, I have view, create, edit, delete, assign, or share, and I can have some others. We're going to talk about those permissions. And then we have some capabilities. We're going to cover this in a second, and the permissions for the workflows, and list of the user that use this role. If you would like to play a little bit more and really embrace this complex idea about it, there is a example in our documentation, and this is pretty complex example. So we have the system with two organizations, with business units and business unit with subsidiaries, few users, and they created some entities. And here there's a full information which user in scope of which organization will have access to specific entity in those given conditions. Okay, so we are not going to cover this right now. We will do a little simpler example during the theory, but if you ever need to really dig into it, this is quite good document to start from. So First of all, entity may, but doesn't have to have an owner. So owner can be one of those entities. It can be a user, it can be a business unit, or in enterprise edition, it can be organization. Why only in enterprise? Because in community there is only one organization, which means that the organization owner is a global owner. And owner is used to check the permission, and it is specified on the entity configuration. So right now, let's open this contact. I will be opening this in IDE. So open contact entity. And here I have the ownership section. Okay, so in the config annotation, we already know, in the default values, I specify the ownership. So owner type is the user, business unit, organization. We're going to talk about it. It's a very important field. Then we specify in which field this owner should be kept. So I have owner field owner. We specify the column name, and we always should pass also do fields for keeping the organization. So the entity will be assigned to the owner and also to the organization. So I should create those two columns for owner, but also, as I remember, there is a thread to do this. Oh, thread. Okay, sorry, the thread is only for front store owners. So I have those columns probably just here in the entity. Yeah, I have the field to keep those owner information. So why owner is so important? So once you create this annotation, this will be stored and the relation will be used. It is possible to change the ownership of entity, but this is not simple. So at the beginning, when you design the system, when you think about the entities and the security, you should think about this ownership. So the type of the owner also tells us what is the granulation of the ownerships we would like to use later on. So if we assign the entity to the user, then we will be able to set specifically which user is the owner of this entity and he created. So user will be owning the entity. If I assign it to the business unit, I will lose the information about which specific user created, but in many cases, in many entities, this is not like required information. And in this case, if there are 5 users in specific business unit, if any of them create this entity, it will still be assigned to their business unit. So I will be not able to set to differentiate which specific user create this entity. I will only know in which business unit this entity was created. Okay, so I have a little less information and a little simplified security for this entity, and it goes up, so I can also assign it to the organization. In this case, I will be not able to say only owners of this business unit can see this entity because I will not have this information inside the entity. I will know only in which organization it was created. We're gonna see some examples in a second. And also here, it's important to check this is ownership. It's not yet security. And owner type, it's how you protect it for the backend purposes. There are some entities that are available from the backend and from the frontend. And for example, I think it's order. So in order ownership, I have columns for the backend owner, and I have separate columns for the frontend owner, right? So order is owned by a salesperson, and also it's owned by the front store user who created this order, right? So I keep those two information inside, and they can be used for the front store and backend security. So there are 2 types of security. First is entity-based, and the second one is action-based. Again, in UI, just a second, it's here. First one, this is entity-based, and the second one is capabilities. So this is action-based. So if you think about some entity, you can of course check the permission to view it, edit, delete, right? But some of the permissions are not strictly related to a specific entity. They are more like action. For example, send emails. If you would like to say if the specific role can send emails, you will be not able to connect it with any entity. So this is the action. So we call it capabilities, and this is permission for actions. We're gonna cover both of them separately. First, we're gonna talk about the entity permissions. And actually, let me modify one of those so you see how it would look. So I can edit the role. I can go to the contact. And here, when I click, I have other levels that I can set for this specific role, right? So the font for the view, I have none, user, business unit, division, and the global. This is called access levels. And depending on the owner, I have different lists. For if the owner of the entity is the user, of course, I can assign the access level of user. So in this case, this role will be able to see contacts only created by itself. So it will check the ownership, and this is the owner, the same as the user that is currently logged in. I will see the entity. If I have it business unit, I will see the records created by anyone in my business unit or business units, because I can actually be part of few business units. If the owner type will be business unit, I will never be able to set the access level to the user, because I will not have the information of the specific user which created this entity. So then the lowest granulation, lowest access level, it will be business unit, okay? And let's find some entity that have different user owner type. So let's copy this and let's search for the entities. And okay, report have the access level of the business unit, right? So right now, if I found the report here, I do not have the user access level, okay? So this is how the owner type works. So when I create the entity, when I think about its security, I should think how specifically I should be able to define the access to it. If I need the information about the very exact user that created, or it is enough to work on business unit level, or maybe even on division, we're gonna talk about it in a second, or the global or organization levels, okay? So this is the moment when it's good to answer those, contact your client and think about the security. It's possible to change, but this is not very simple migration. So you should, if you can avoid it, it's better, of course. So first, I have the permissions. I have view, create, edit, delete, assign. Those are the default ones. Because for the most of the entities, I will be using only those. But there are some specific entities that have very specific actions, and I would like to also restrain possibility to execute those. One of those entities would be, for example, price list. And by the way, here at the end, you have tabs. Okay, so those helps you to navigate on those lists of the entities. And for me, it's just simpler now to use the search price list. And for the price list, I have view, create, edit, delete, share, but also I have recalculate, okay? So I can recalculate price list, I can change some conditions. You're gonna talk about price list on the commerce webinar. And then if I have the permissions, I should be able to click recalculate. So how to create new permission? This is super simple. For this, we have specific YAML, which is called permissions YAML. So let's find it in pricing bundle. Pricing bundle and permissions YAML. Just a second. And there you go. So we have all permissions, and we defined new permission like recalculate, and then we added label, we have the group names. So group names, if this is permission for the backend or for the frontend. If you make it empty or default, it will be backend permission. If you add commerce, it will be for the front store. If you should apply this to all, of course not. You want to create this permission specifically for one entity, so you set it to false, and then you specify the list of entities to which you add this permission. So you apply to entities, and here you specify price list class name. And that's it. This is how you created permission for this specific entity, and then you can check or assign this permission to the role as any other permission that was created in the system. Okay, so it's just a permissions YAML, and you just add this. And there are a few more examples. If you would like to find them, you can search by the permissions YAML. And for order, for example, you can have payment history or charge the payment. For inventory, there are different ones. Okay, so if you have some specific needs, you can create new permissions and assign them to some entities. Then, if we do not have ownership, so we are not having the information who created this entity, and this is really use case for many cases, then I will be only able to set none or global access level, right? Because I will not be able to check the ownership. So either given role have the access or it have not. And if there is an ownership, depending of the ownership type, I will have none, user, business unit, division, organization, and global. And now let's talk about this division organization. So division is a group of business units. As you remembered, I had this ACME general business unit, and it had two subsidiaries. So if I will have business unit access level, I will be able to see the records that were created by any user assigned to my business unit. If I will have the division, I will have access to the record created by user of my business unit or its subsidiaries. So if I will be in ACME West and have the division and business units is exactly the same because it doesn't have any subsidiaries. But if I'll be in ACME General, if I have the business unit access level, I will see all the records created inside by the users that are part of the ACME General. If I have division, I will have access to records created by users of this business unit, but also its subsidiaries, both of them. Okay, so this is difference between the business unit and the division. And also, if you have the Enterprise Edition, there is additional organization level. If you are working on the Community Edition, organization and global is the same because there is only one organization. So this is, I think there is no more chart here. And here there is a business, the access levels and the constants created in the system to assign those if you would need to work with the permissions. And the default permissions you have. In Enterprise Edition, there is also share, so you can share some records with different users. You do not have this in Community Edition. Then how we can enable this ACL for the entity. So we added in the config annotations. Again, let's open the IDE. And in the contact, we had the ownership, and right next to it, we have the security. So we specify the type, the group name, we already told about, is default or commerce, and the category is the name of the tab in which it should be displayed on the backend. So if I go to the roles and edit one of the role, those are the categories, okay? So the contact, as you saw, was in the account management. If I click account management, the contact is here. So this is it. This is how I added to the entity configuration. And if the entity is already there and I updated its configuration, I would have to execute the command to update it in database. Excuse me. So I just bin console or entity config update, then this information goes to database, and I have enabled the security for this specific entity. This is how it looks in the layers. So I have global, then it's organization. If I have the enterprise edition, then it's divisions, then the business unit, user, and none. Global and none is always there. The rest of those levels depends on the ownership type. So how we define them? We already created the annotation, so we enabled the ownership. We set the ownership, we enabled the security, and now we would like to create some rules. First of all, we can create them in the controller annotations. Let's follow this link. And in the, actually, I will show it in IDEs, simpler. User controller, and for the view action. So I have the two annotations here. So ACL, and this is how I define the permission. So I create some ID. By default, as you can see, they are pretty similar to the route names because the route name is also connected to the entity. So here I have oral user, user view. I have the type. So this is entity based. So the type is entity. The other one for capabilities would be action. I have the class for which I should be able to, I should check the permission, and the permission type. So right now, if I would like to see this action, the system will check if I have the permission for the user entity and the view permission, right? And I don't have to copy this all the time. So if I would like to reuse it, I would use ACL ancestor annotation. Here actually I'm reusing the different one, but this is the key, so just the ID. If I ever would like to reuse this, I would just copy the ID and have ACL ancestor. So it is exactly the same as this one. I just don't have to define other arguments again. In most cases, you will work only with this. So you will define the annotations in the controller. But there are some cases, and I will show you in a second, when you would like to define them in YAMLs. For example, I have resources, or ACLs YAML. And let's check if there is any already in the core. Yep, there is. And let's find one with the bindings. But probably this will not be that simple. Oh, I have it. Okay, so now let's think that we already have installed application and we would like to change the security of some specific action. Okay, for example, I would like to check different permissions. I would not like to check user permission, I would like to check user naming permission. It is not possible to change the annotation without overwriting the controller, which will be a lot to do and not the best practice. I could just create ACLs YAML, define some permission, exactly the same attributes like in the annotation. So I have the type, I have the class, permission, I have category, and now additional thing, I have bindings. So I can bind this specific permission to a controller action. And in this case, it will be like I would add this annotation to this controller action. So whenever I go to this controller action, I will check this additional permission. So this is how you can add some additional permissions to existing controller actions. Pretty useful thing. Okay, so we enabled security, we defined the ownership type, we added some ACLs to the actions or to entities, and now how can we check if somebody has permissions or not? First of all, we can check in PHP code, and depending which version you use, you can get the service by the name or by the class name, and then is granted entity permission type and the entity to which you would like to check, and the answer is Boolean, of course. In the YAMLs, you have something called ACL resource, and here you pass only the permission name. So this is the thing you can have here in the YAMLs, or the ID in the annotation. Okay, so this is how you protect in the YAML. For example, data grids. And the last but not least, in tweak template, you have is granted. And again, it looks very similar as in the controller. Let's find it actually. Is granted in some tweak. So we can see is granted. I pass the name and I display button or none. Okay, so do not have it connected. So now let's gonna talk about some example. For example, we talk about some call center. We have the administrator, manager of organization, then we have manager of call center. We have 3 different departments which have manager and 2 operators each. Okay? So this is our organization and this is how we structure the business units and the organization, so logical division. And the example would be operator. So our requirement would be that operator must be able to see only contacts assigned directly to him. So what should be the ownership type and what access level should operator have? Okay, try to think about it, and in a second we will continue the discussion. Again, this is how it looks. And each of those operators should only see records they created by themselves. So those operators are the users, which mean then the ownership should be set to the user, because I would need this granulation to check if I created this entity or not. And then the ACL, I should check it should be the view, and the access level is the user. In this case, operator role, if I assign it to specific user, he will be only able to see the records created strictly by himself. Then we have the manager of the department, and he should be able to see the contacts assigned to all operators in his department. Ownership type is the same. We cannot change it. Its ownership is per entity, not per role. So ownership is user. The thing I change is I change the access level for the manager of department role, and it should be business unit. Okay, so I have the permission view, level is business unit, and the important thing is that the manager and the operators should be part of the same business unit, of course. And another examples are very similar. So manager of call center should be able to see the records of all departments, and this is when we use the division. So he will be able to see records assigned to his business unit and assigned to subsidiary business units. And the last one is the organization. So he will be able to see of all the departments and the divisions. Administrator is just global. So this is how you should divide the example. So we have business units. There's 3 of them. So in our example, it would be ECMI West, East, and North, for example. Then we have business unit call center, ACMI General, and this is called the division because it has some subsidiaries. Above this, I have the organization. If this will be enterprise, I can copy hold this box and multiply many times because I can have many organizations. And above all the organization, there is administrator with the global permission. So he have access to all the organizations and all the records assigned them. So this is all about the entity. The second part is the action permissions. So if there is an action I would like to restrict somehow, and it's not connected to entity, like copying the address or sending an email. This is how we create the capabilities. First of all, there are no access levels. There is only yes or no. So it's like none or global. And there is no permission. So I just create the capability and check this specific capability if this is allowed for given role or denied. And let's see. So if I go to the capabilities, as you can see, I only have the checkbox yes or no. Okay, so here I already have one. We're gonna see this in the practice. And how we defined it. As I said, it's very similar to the entities. So first I can do this in control annotations. exactly the same way with the difference of the type. So I had entity type, now I have the action type, I specify the label, and that's the only difference, right? So now I'm able to execute, for example, search. This is a very good example for the permission. If I should search or not, to which entity I could assign this. No, it would be difficult, right? Because this is related to action, not to specific data. So I have, again, the same ACL annotations, just with a different type. And the same way I can go and do in the ACLs YAM. Excuse me, it's here. And in the ACLs YAM, the difference will be, again, only in type. Okay, so this is first, if I want to restrict some access, I think if this is access to the entity or to some specific action, I create it either in annotation on the ACLs YAM, I define the specific type, and that should be it. Of course, I need to then check this with the permission checker. How to check? You can see it's very similar. So we use the same services, but I have is granted and do not surpass entity because I just checked this capability. In YAML is exactly the same, and in Twig it's very similar to the controller, so I just check if I have this capability granted or not. So there are two more things to cover here. So first of all, we have something like workflow permissions. We're going to talk about the workflows on Thursday, actually. And the workflow permissions are here and below. Workflows. So I have list of the workflows. I can set global permission for given workflow. So if I can see the workflow or change perform the transitions. If those are set to none, none of those below matter because this role will not have access to this specific workflow. If I allow it, so I change it to different level, then permissions for specific transactions will be checked. For example, I can allow this workflow to specific users, but only to the certain step when his manager should take place and continue the workflow. Okay, so this is how you assign workflow permissions. And the last one we only want to talk briefly, we also have something like field-based ACLs. So we can protect not only whole entity, but specific fields. And one of entity that have it enabled by default is opportunity. So let's find opportunity. Excuse me for a second. And here in security sections, I have field ACL supported set to true. Okay, so that's the only difference. Now I can go to the entity management or execute the migration, of course. Find the opportunity. Edit it. And here there is a field level ACL if I should enable and show restricted. So if I should show the restricted fields and just do not add possibility to create or edit them or just hide them completely. Okay, so let's not show them. So I just enabled the field level ACL. Now if I save it, if I go to the roles management again, and actually I will change this for administrator. Usually you don't want to mess with administrator roles. This is just for the demonstration purposes. And I edit administrator, so myself roles and permissions. I can find the opportunity. And now I have the plus icon here, so I can extend it. And I can see all the fields. And to the fields, I have the specific permissions. So let's check the opportunities right now. When this can be useful, for example, if I work with the budgets. I want my sales representatives to work with opportunities, contact with the clients, but I'm not surely want them to see the revenue or the budget. So I can display the opportunities for them, but hide, for example, budget amount. Okay, so right now I have the list. I can see the budget amount here. If I go to the view page, I can also see it here, and in the edit, it's also there. Right now, I would revoke this to the administrator. So I should find the budget. Oh, it didn't load the translation for some reason, and just set it to the none. So I cannot view it. See, I don't have the information here. So as you can see, the data grid is already protected with the ACLs. And on the view page, it's also not here. So this is what you remember I talked about on Thursday. If you just display the budget, it will be displayed. So to make it work like this, if I open the opportunity, and actually let's find the view page for it. Oh, come on. I'm always using the render property or render HTML property because inside there is an ACL check. So if I will be just displaying the entity budget amount value, it will display always. It doesn't matter what permission I set, okay? Because it will just display the value. If I want this to be protected, I should use those macros. And here I should still be able to see it in the edit page because I didn't revoke the permissions for create or update. So let's do this right now. And create none, edit none, save. And it should be gone from the form. In the form, it's actually handled by the extension. So it's different way than for the view. As you can see, I do not have budget anymore. And the last thing, I could go again to this entity management, and I can mark this show restricted. And now, okay, well, it's not here yet, or maybe it's just on the view. Okay, I would have to check this, and I will update you on the Slack channel what I did wrong. Actually, I think it's just some cache issue. Okay, and there is some docs. Again, I recommend the documentation from the first slides when you have all this organization structure and information which user have access to which entity. It really helps you understand this fully. And some best practices. Almost all controllers, action, links, buttons, everything should be covered with ACL checks. You have many tools to do this. So you have those annotations. You have annotations, possibility to cover this in YAMLs and in tweaks again. And if you think there is a specific action, you can create the capability. Or if there is some specific operation on given entity, you can create permissions YAM and create new permission for specific entity. Okay, some questions answered, guys. We have like 5 to 10 minutes, so please feel free to ask anything. And also, I saw there is some question on the Slack channel. Okay, so Abhishek, Symfony replace services. The instruction in documentation do not match what being taught in the training. Is there better reference somewhere else? Quick info on decorator structures. And what do you mean it doesn't match? If you could please, okay, let's continue this topic in the Slack. And Max, entity extend migration update config leads to, Max, please try to remove the cache first and then execute this migration. I will just add it also comment here. And now we have two questions and answers, sorry, questions here in the chat. So Beamers, what additional overhead might enabling field-based ACL calls onto site performance? So I will not be able to give you the specific numbers. For sure, there will be some performance difference because you will be not checking just if you have access to specific permission, but each field separately. If there is a many fields, it can cause some delay in performance, but it shouldn't be big ones because this is really strongly cached. So you can run some tests, but this difference should not be big. Christian, is it simple to add our own new entities to fully participate in RBAC? Example, new entity that is owned by business unit and can be edited by one or more roles. Yeah, Christian, it's very simple. So actually, we're gonna cover this in a second. We already created new entity in previous week, user naming type. And in a second, we're gonna add some security for this. We are not going to work with the permission type, so we will not have access levels here, but it works exactly the same as for the contact. So yeah, it's really no big issue. Okay, guys, so I will show you the practice and then we'll do the 15 minutes break, okay? So let me close the tabs. And the security access control list practice session. So for example, we will be doing something like this. We add security section to user naming type entity without ownership, okay? Then we apply ACL resources to the controller. So we check permissions in the controller in both data grids and make sure if they work. Then we add some check on showing the grid of related users only if there is a specific permission for the user entity. So I can protect the data in the data grid. This is actually automatically done. I can also protect the whole data grid or even the whole rendering of the macro. So this on different levels. And then ACL capability to allow showing naming information at the user view page. Okay, so step by step, first we should add security to the user naming type entity. So I have user naming type, I go to the entity, and I add this security. As you remember in the slides, there is a command that you should execute at this moment. And it's here, or entity config update. So let's execute this. Usually I would just run the Oro update, platform update. It will execute all those commands for me. Right now, I know there were no migrations. I just want to load the config update. Okay, it's done. And right now, if I go to the application, if I go to the roles and check it, for example, here. I have username type, and there is only none or global because I do not have ownership for this entity, right? So I cannot use any other access levels. Then we should protect the controller and both data grids. So if I go to IDE, I should open the controller. I have, actually here I can reuse. As you can see, the order doesn't matter. So I can define it here in the view action and then reuse it in the index. View and the index here use the same permission, and usually they use the same view permission. So I define it, I have some name of this permission, the type is entity, then I specify the class and which permission should be checked. So right now, if I revoke this permission, let's try to do this for administrator. The better, of course, example would be to create new user with the manager role, revoke it for manager. But it will be faster this way. So I go to the administrator, edit it. Find the username again, and said I do not have access to view it. It should do two things. First of all, this route is protected, and this route is used in navigation YAM. So navigation YAM also is protected. So if I refresh the page, I should not even see this in the menu navigation. As you can see, it's gone. Okay, so I do not have access to it. If I would remember the route, I should be able to type it. So let's check if this is protected, if somebody knows the route. So it's routing, username. Yep, it's forbidden. I cannot access this. Okay, so actually let me restore it. Oh, actually one. Okay, let's restore it first. Okay, and now if I would also like to protect the data grids, I would go to the data grids YAML and add this ACL resource. ID I created already in the controller. If I would not have this in controller, I could create this in ACLs YAML. So now I will not see the data grid if I do not have this permission. And also, as you've seen already, all the records and all the fields are protected, and there is an ACL helper. This is applied to all the data grids by default. You can skip the ACL check for the specific data grids. Let me check if I can find you the option for this data grid YAML, and there is ACL. Okay, skip ACL apply. So I can pass this to the source, really be careful with this one, and then the ACLs will not be applied to the results of this data grid. Really use it with cautious. Then I should show this grid of related users on the view page only if I have permission to the view. So first of all, the data grid is protected, but it is protected with the user view, naming view, and here it's with the user view. It depends which record you are displaying, of course. And the second one, you can also protect the whole section. So I can go to the view page of user naming, and here I can check if this is granted, and only if I have access to this user view, I will merge this data grid to the data blocks. So otherwise, it will be not added to the data blocks. And the last thing, I can create the ACL. So if this should be displayed or no. So if I go to the user view page, as you remember, on the very first day, we created the scroll data listener and injected the information about here. As remember, this is what we're gonna protect right now. Okay, so right now we should create the capability, for example, in ACLs YAM. So I have ACLs YAM, training user naming info. Let's check, where do we check it? Where is my search box? And I check it in the naming listener. So first of all, I created capability. Then if I go to the rows, I should be able to see it. Again, capabilities are displayed below the entity permissions. So actually go to the administrator role again. And here I have user naming information. It's enabled for administrator by default. I go to my user view naming listener. I inject the authorization checker there. So here in the service definition, as you can see, I do not have the argument because it was auto-configured for me and injected there as I have it hinted here. And right inside, before I even start to check if I have the entity and rendering the template, I check if I have it granted or not, right? There is no entity here, it's just action. I have the possibility to see it or not. So if I have it, it is displayed. If I just revoke it for myself, at the very beginning of the listener, it will just return. So it will not add additional information to the scroll data. Okay, it's gone. And that's it. Okay, guys, so let's do the 15 minutes break and we're gonna talk about the import export. So we're gonna start 40 past. Okay, guys, I think we can continue. So Abhishek, about your question in the Slack channel, the way you override services or decorate services is really a Symfony thing, not a specific. So it will be the same. It can be different only if you are using auto wiring or not. Okay, so that's the thing that depends. For example, what is your name of your service and if you should do some additional aliases or not. Okay, but it should really work just the same way. If you have any more specific questions, sure, please post them to the channel. We can continue the discussion. And Max, about your question, please let me know what environment are you using. And for me, it looks like it cannot generate this file inside the cache, so it's not possible to process. You can try, of course, just for a second to give it the full permissions to cache and check if it would work. Then also please type or Symfony permissions, directory permissions, and there is a quite good doc. And few, depending which environment you use, it Linux, Mac, or Windows, how can you set the correct permissions for the directories. Also, I saw this few times when somebody was using Docker or some other background, and there was issue, if, for example, for the cache synchronization. So yeah, please continue the discussion and we'll find out how we can help you. Guys, we can have 5 minutes if you have any questions to this ACLs. It's really important topic. You should always think about protecting the data. So if you have any questions about the theory or any questions about the practice solution I show you, please feel free to ask them. And really, it can be anything, and we can discuss it. And in 5 minutes, so I wait 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes we'll start with the import-export theory. And then we're gonna follow with the import export practice, and this will be all for today. So please think if there is anything not clear about the ownership or the access levels, is the moment to discuss. Thank you, Adrian. Yeah, it's quite a good question. So depends what you mean by extending ACLs. So it's very simple to use them. If you want to, extend any functionality, you will need to see how it works in the below the surface, and there is some bit masks used and so on. So it's not that simple. If you would like to just apply additional ACLs to specific actions or controller, you can do this with ACLs YAM and use this binding option. If you would like to extend the whole functionality, please give me some use case. So of course, we could extend it, but what do you have in mind? Do you have like specific use case? Also, one good thing to show you. So if, for example, you created this new entity and would like to load the permissions to it, there is a way to do this automatically. There is a file called backcontrols, and this file is going to be executed every time you install the application. If you update and want to run it again, it's a little bit different. But if you create this file and put it in the correct directory, so rm data backcontrols yam, here you have the name of the role, the permission, here is entity or capability or action, sorry, and you specify which you should have. And this is system create edit. You had this on the slide. Those are the constants that are relative to the access level. So this is how you can assign the roles, the permissions to the roles when you install the application. So you create a new entity and you don't have to do this through the UI. You can do this automatically using backend roles or front-end roles. If you already have the application installed, this will not be executed because this migration was already done, and you will need to load it using your migration, and I will send you the example later on. So this is just an additional note. Okay, guys, there is no more questions, so let's continue with the import-export. For this, I'm gonna check out to another branch. Next one, actually. Oh, excuse me. And run the application update so I don't have to think if there is any specific things related to this branch, like migrations or config changes. And it will do the things for me. Before running this, I should always clear the cache or remove it better. Okay, so let me just find the slides. And there we go. So importing and exporting of the entities. So we are using Akanio batch bundle, and this is done asynchronously via the consumer. So we have some data, either if we import from CSV on, then we split it into batches, the file, or if we export, we get the entities to export and also split them in the batches. Those batches are executed parallel, and also the integrations. We're going to talk about the integration and the message queue tomorrow. Those are all a little bit connected. And the integrations with data sync are using the import-export functionality. So it's important. We're not gonna go with debug through this process like in details, but I will try to explain it as possible, as thorough as possible. Also, there is a link for you to understand the abstract concepts of the batch processing. This is from the Spring actually, but the concept is very similar. So we have some job repository. There is a job launcher, which launches the job and actually executes the job execution. And this job execution can have many steps. And every step have reader, processor, and the writer. And this is the thing we're gonna focus right now. Okay, so This is quite long, but really good to understand the abstract concepts of the batch processing. So we have the jobs, and those jobs, actually, you have them defined. So for most of the import exports you're gonna build, you don't have to play with them at all. And those are used to trigger import and export of the entities. Each job have the step, and inside the step, it has a reader, processor, and the writer defined. Okay, so it can be different for every job. And let's see those batch jobs that are here by default. So there are import export bundle, and inside we have the jobs. And first we have entity export to CSV, entity export template, entity import validation, entity import from CSV, entity export to XLS, and entity export template to XLS. So we have 6 of them. As you can see, for each of them, we have the title, we have the type. So there are 4 types. We're gonna talk about them in a second. And we have the steps. Actually, for each job, there is only one step. And for this step, again, we have the title, we have the class, and the most important, we have the services. And those are those 3 services we talked about: reader, processor, and the writer. And this is the main thing that is gonna do the import export for us. Okay, so we're just gonna reuse those jobs in most of the cases. Usually we create new jobs for the integrations. So first of all, and how it works. We have some reader. Reader reads data from the data source, and this is true for both the import and the export. We only change the blocks, so the reader and the writer usually just switch places or are just different, and the processor always processes the information. So the readers have the data source, reads the data source, and return only one row at a time and passes to the processor. Then the processor, there is a lot of different processors, but so the processor defined for this specific entity type, process this one data row, return it one row at the time to the writer. Writer receives batch, and after the batch, it saves the data to the data source. Okay, so this is the abstract concept, and this is the same for both the import and the export of the entities. So first we have the processors, and the attacked or import export processor. We think about them like they always work on the one row of data, and inside they have 3 very important services. So they have data converter, they have serializer, and optionally they can have a strategy. So we recommend to put everything, all the services definitions that are related to the import-export, to the special container import-export YAM. It's exactly the same as services YAM. It starts with the services, and it's just the same. You just put it in different file to have logic separation for all the services, because there's quite few related to the import-export. If you're gonna follow this way, you just should remember to load this file in your extension. So when you have the dependency injection directory, there is extension, and you always load services, and additionally here we load import-export. We do this for few functionalities. We usually do the same separation for the integrations, for the APIs, or for the form types. So if they are logically separated, it's simpler to find them. And you know, for example, if you find the service, oh, this is used for import-export. Okay, so you don't have to do this. You can put all of them in the services YAM, but then the file will be quite big, and you should think about some order of services. So it's up to you. So here in import export, you can also add some comments and group those services in sections. And the one we're going to talk right now is the processors. So as you can see, we have 4 processors, and it's going to be true for many entities. So we have processor to import the information. We have processor to validate export or export template. But also, and this is the example here, we can have different strategies. For example, we are importing the contacts, and we can have few different way to process. First of all, import only new. Okay, so we have some field that we use for the identifier of the contact. It can be many fields, and only if the contact is new, so there is no field with this identifier, import it. Or we can have add or replace. So for example, add new and replace the old one. So okay, so this can be different strategies, and for them we can use different processors. In most of the cases, you will use the parent import abstract, for example. You just call set data converted and the set strategy. And then you are using tags, so for which type this should be used. In most cases, the import and import validation will be the same. They use exactly the same processor, right? If you think about the import and the import validation, they read the same data source, they process the data exactly same way, they just have different writer, because one writes to the database and the other have no writer, so it doesn't write. So it just validate and throw all the errors for you, but it doesn't write the records to the database. Okay, so the processor is the thing that know how to process the rows and know the logic what to do with them. Okay, and for the export, it's a little bit simpler. There is no strategy. We're going to talk about this in a second. So there is only set data converter. And there is a difference for the export template. So first of all, I will show you where to find those import export in the UI. So we go to the trainings, and I will open the mail capture. Excuse me just a second. Okay, yeah, I had it open. Okay, and it's building the cache right now. It run all the updates, so it will take a second, but it's already here. And then we go, for example, to the contacts. Excuse me, contacts. And we have those buttons. We're going to talk about how to add them in a second. So if we click import file, there is actually the import with different strategies, because as you saw, we had them here. So I had two import processors and they were using different strategy. One is using the contact strategy add, and the other one is add replace. Thanks to this, I have this drop down. If I would be only having one import processor with one strategy, it will be just selected here. So I can select the file here. And once I select the file, I can validate or I can import, right? The second thing here, I have the export template. And this is important to remember that this is the only thing in import-export done synchronously. So once I click it, I'm downloading the template file. I can open this as a CSV. And here I have the information how it should look like, the template. So I have all the columns and some dummy data. So I have some information. So the user that would like to prepare the file for import would know what data type he should use for each of those columns. Okay, so this is the important information. So you should always provide the import template for your users to work with. Otherwise, you will say, oh, it doesn't work, the columns names are wrong or something, because they do not have the template. So this is always recommended to provide one. Okay, all other buttons works asynchronously. So for example, if I click export right now, I will have the information that it started, but actually it will not start unless I start consuming the queue. So right now I'm consuming, so it reads the information from database. If there is a need, it creates the patches. And at the very end, it sends the email to the user address who clicked the button. And here I have the information. It was performed successfully, how many contacts were exported, and I can download the file. We're gonna talk about very specific how this works with the batches and the email being sent on the message queue topic. What you should also see right now, if I click this button, it's always linked to the prod environment. So right now, because I do not have the prod cache built, it's gonna take a moment unless I change this to dev environment. And then I have the file immediately. And I can see the CSV with the exported records. Okay, all the records are here. Now, I could remove most of it. And let's leave those two and save the file. Okay, so this is the export. I also show the export template. Now we can import those. So I can import, I can pick the file here and click validate first. Okay, the validation is completed. I have the information, there was 0 errors, that I processed 2 rows and read 2 rows. And actually we didn't change anything, so we can try to change some dummy information. For example, the phone for this user. 128, something really small. And this is for Jerry Coleman. Okay, so the second thing, we can import the information. So click the same, I just click the different button, and this one, import, and it's gonna process. Okay, it's done. And I have the email, and there's a summary, which file was imported, and how many was processed, how many updated or replaced. And now if I look for Jerry, I saw the address, the phone already here is changed. Okay, so I've updated the records pretty simply. And okay, let's continue with the slides. So we have the processors. You've seen actually 4 processors in actions. So you've seen export template, export, and I executed 1 import processor, but you saw that I have a drop down to choose which I want to use. So then we have the data converter. So it takes the header of the file, the CSV file, and knows how to convert it to the complex associative array, which then will be used by the normalizer to create, the denormalizer to create the entity. Okay, by default, you will use the default data converter, but if you would like to create the custom one, of course, there's possibility you just extend the abstract table data converter, which has some information how to convert to export format and how to convert to import format. And you just extend those. So we have custom data converter, for example, here, which is used for the inventory, and we override the headers. So SKU should be used to this. This is how you define the relation. So product SKU. So this is like the relation or the property. Product default name. So you just create some mapping here, and you just register this in the import export YAM or in the services if you decided not to use this way. And this usually you'll be using the parent service just to avoid injecting all the required arguments, and then just change the class. Okay, so we already have custom data converter. The default one, this is pretty straightforward, but actually just traverse through all the headers and create either if you go from the complex array to the single dimensional array, or reverse from single dimensional array to complex array. Okay, so it creates the information. And all of this is used in the normalizer. Here, this is the article I really like about the serialization in the Symfony. So this is how serialization works, right? So we have some object, and we would like to convert it to some format, JSON, XML, or CSV. Okay, If you would not have the normalization and here encoding, we would have to create the separate serializer for each entity to each format, right? So if we have username type, we create different serializer for the JSON, XML, CSV, and if it will be more formats, we have to create new serializers, which is not very good. So the idea is that you always normalize your entity to some uh, standard, like array in this example, and then array to this JSON format. Thanks to this, you have less serializers to create. You just always know how to normalize your object, and then this normalized array is converted to JSON, XML, or CSV. So if you think about this in ORO perspective, you have some object, you normalize it to the array, and then data converter knows the format of this array, converts it to the single dimensional array, and then it's encoded to the JSON or actually in our case CSV. Going other way around, we have the CSV, it's converted to single dimensional array, then the data converter knows how to convert this single dimensional array into complex associative array, and then the denormalization takes the process and the object is created, okay? Of course, in all of those cases, you can inject your own code, you can create own normalizers, own data converters, or just even all your process totally custom. Excuse me. So go back here, we have the normalizers, and they are responsible for normalization and the denormalization of entity. So they know object, and they convert it to this multidimensional array, then is then processed by the data converter. By default, in most cases, you have the configurable normalizer, and it just go through all the metadata of the entity. If this is relation, it's go on and go on to other objects as long as those fields should be serialized. We're gonna see this in annotations. If this is property, just check if this is import export enabled or disabled. If you would like to create custom normalizer, there are two methods you should implement: support normalization or support denormalization. As you can see here, for example, this normalizer will return true if the data is instance of contact, right? So it will normalize only the contact entity. So we have the contact, we call the normalize, it have all the normalizers in the registry, it calls one after another, and if n returns true, it will be normalizing the entity. If none of the normalizer at the very end, there is this default one, and it will just perform the default normalization. And here for the support denormalizations, as you think, we do the denormalization, from the array, so you do not have object, you cannot change the instance. So you can check, for example, some specific data or a specific column of this array. Okay, so this is how you support denormalization. And once those two methods you have, there is also normalize and denormalize. So here for the context, as you can see, we would call the default normalization. And then additionally, we will do some special denormalization for social fields. So in this case, we will use the URL formatter to format the links to the social media, like to Twitter or Facebook, okay? So we have default way, and then you just add some additional information to the normalized object. So again, this is really, really important to understand this process of serialization. And when do you have normalized, then inside here, inside this array block, we have data conversion, and then we just have singular array, single dimensional array, encoded or just written as a CSV. And reverse is go the same way. Pretty important to understand. It's much easier to understand whole concept. At the very end, we have the import strategy. So when we think about import, we have the CSV file. Excuse me. We read every row of the CSV. We convert it to the multi-dimensional array with data converter. We denormalize it to the object, and then we have the strategy. So we have the object already, so with the field properties from the CSV row, and what to do with it. By default, we'll be using configurable add or replace strategy. This is really a big class with a lot of edge cases handled, but you can use it for user naming type, and out of the box, it will know if it will update or create new rows when you import the records. Of course, you can create custom strategy. For example, for account, we have extended the configurable strategy, and here we have some logic. For example, if account has some contacts, I can remove all the contacts that are there and then import the new ones from the CSV file. Okay, so it really depends on your use case. So your client wants to import the data, and your client will tell you, I want to synchronize categories, or before the import, remove all the categories and imports the new one, or if I should merge the product, or always the new product wins, so I can remove the old product and import the new one. Or even I can define which fields should be handled with special care or differently. Okay, so this is the strategy. So the logic, how to process the ready information when saving it to database. So we think about the strategy only when we import. When we export, we just have this array and we write it to the CSV, so there is no strategy. The strategy is only when we import the information to database, we already have the objects denormalized, and we want some logic, like what to do with relations or what to do with specific fields. If you do not have any special logic, you can easily just use configurable add or replace, and it will work just fine. To create this custom, again, as you can see, we're extending the parent service and just pointing to new class, so it's very simple. Of course, if your logic is way different than the default one, you will not be using this add or replace strategy. You will just create your default one from the very beginning, so your custom one. Now, what processor step do we have? You already have seen. It's import validation, it's import, export template, and export. This is just, again, the same link to the definitions of those. So here we have the processors, and for those processors, we have different converters and strategy. And for the export, we just have the converter. Usually the data converter for the import and the export is the same one. See, it's ORO import export data converter contact. So what's different, of course, it's tagging. And we're gonna talk about tags in a second, but as you can see, we have always the name ORO import export processor, but then the important one is the type. So we have those 4 types: import, import validation, export, export template. Then you specify for which entity this processor is, and you create some alias. And why do we need this alias? We're gonna talk in a second. So what's the difference between those processors? And this is, as I told you, the abstract is really the same. The difference is just with the input and the output. So if we think about validating the file, we have the normal CSV file reader. We process it with all the information. So we have converter, cellularizer strategy, but we never write this data to the database. We just send the summary. Okay, that's it. Import is exactly the same. As you can see, the only difference is with the with the writer. We use the entity writer. So we process the rows the same way, and then we store them to database. That's it. Then we have the exporting template. Here the difference is where to get the information from. You don't want to get real data to be exported in the template as a, the example of the data. It's, of course, first security issue or data issue. So you just want to create some fake information. Like, for example, we did this entity for the example of usernaming, right? We created some entity that is not persisted in database, and we passed this entity to the full name provider. here it's similar thing. We create some fake entity, we populate it with some information just to have the correct information, so the user will be able to see the correct data format. Then we process it with the data converter, serializer, and we write it to CSV file exactly the same way as we would write the normal export results. So as you can see here, the only difference between export template and export processor is the reader. So once we read from this fake source, the other way we read from the entities. And now how we configure the import export. Again, we have config field annotation with the scope of import export. And the fields we can use are header, order, identity, excluded, or short. Okay, we're gonna talk about each in a second, but also we'll first show you that you can modify them through the UI. So let's open the UI of the application. And if we go here to the entity management, I can find the user naming. Okay, weird. Oh yeah, name is, sorry guys, name is without spaces here. So, and I have the columns here, and I can edit, for example, the title column. And here I will have the import export section. And first I have the column name, and this is header. I have the column position, which is the order. I have used as identity field boolean, sorry, not boolean actually. This is -101. And this is identity from the annotations. And I have exclude column, which is exclude. I do not have the short because this is for the relations. So first of all, header. If I do not specify the header for specific field, the translation of this specific header will be used. So I would go to the translations, or I would go to the data grid for the user naming. And if I do not change it, those headers will be used. So title, naming format, and so on. Then I have the order. So this is just the order in which the columns should be exported to CSV. I have the identity. By default, this is set on the identity of the table. Of course, I can change it, and this is actually in many cases true. For example, I don't want external user to synchronize my contacts on ID because they don't know IDs of my contacts. For example, I want to identify contacts on the email and the first name combination. In such a case, I would set identity to false for the ID, or I would leave it, and then set identity true for the first name and the email columns. Okay, also as you saw on the UI, the free value is not only 2. So for the ID, yeah, I closed it, sorry, again. For example, I could set that the title is my identifier. Then in the row, I will set official, and he will check if there is a title official, and yes, he will update the record instead of creating the new one. And here I have no, only when it's not empty, always. So when this should be used identity. So I don't want, for example, use title as identity when it's empty, right? It makes sense. Then we have the important one, which is excluded. We can exclude the property that's simple, then it will not be in the file, but also we can exclude the relation. So for example, user, when we export user, we can exclude user naming. If we don't do this, our normalizer will go to the user naming object and try to export whole object. So again, he will check the fields. If the fields are exportable, he will add them to the array, to this complex array he is building, okay? And so on and so on. So if I'm including all the objects, he can traverse from object to object and export them. So I can exclude them, but also the second one is the short. If I've defined the short for the relation, and actually let's go to the user for this. So I have user naming relation on the user entity, right? So if I go to the user and open this, there should be naming type here. And there is, it's a relation many to one. If I edit this, I have export fields, and this is for the short. And I can set identity only, it would be short true, or all, it will be short false. So if I set short true, it will not go to this naming type object and try to export everything checking the annotation. It will only export the identity of this entity. Okay, so he will export the user, then he will find there is a relation to naming type, but it is set to short true, so he will just export the ID instead of going inside the object and normalizing it and so on and so on. So this is how you control what should be exported, for example, with the user. Oh, and then how do we define them? So for example, let's check lead. Of course, in ID it will be better. So I go to the properties, and here I have the config field annotation. Just remember, it's different for the entity, it's called config. For field, it's config field. And I have the default values, the namespace is or import export. And I define other keys. So order, then for example, for contact, you can see I have short true. So whenever I'll be exporting lead, if there is a contact assigned, I will not export whole contact, only its identity. And also the order is there. The same goes for the name, for example. There I have the identity true. So where I'll be importing leads, the lead name will be used as an identity. So the strategy will use this field to identify if the row is the new lead or the lead that already exists. So he will do the query to the database, checking for this field. Okay, so this is how you configure it. For most of the fields, you will just use the order. Again, in Oro, you see we are not using next numbers. We have gaps of 10. So if you want to add some field to be exported between those two, you can still do this by setting order 31, for example. Okay, and usually you don't define headers here. You go with the default headers, or you can override them in the UI. Of course, you can change those values later on using this query in migration to change the config field value. Now, we have talked about the processors, data converters, serializers, and the strategies. We created the services, but we need to put all of those together somehow and then display it, okay? And there is two ways to display the import export buttons: the new way and the wrong way. It's not really wrong one, but it's adding some logic to the templates, which is not the recommended way. So the recommended one is buttons from the configuration, and this is used for most of the entities right now. And so then you would go to the index template. In most of the cases, you will add the import export buttons to the index page, right? Because you want to import or export contacts, not the specific contact. You would add those buttons to the view page if you think about the relation of the specific entity. For example, I have order and I want to only export line items of this order. Then I would add export button to the order view page, and it will be export line items, right? It will only export line items of this specific, right? So you think what you want to export, import, but this is rather obvious. So here we use these buttons from configuration. As you can see, we include some template and we just pass the alias, and that's it. It will do the magic if we, of course, have this alias defined in proper way. So let's open this in IDE. Resources, lead, index. We have those buttons from configuration. If you ever need to modify it, let's just check the template, and you will see that actually it includes two templates, export buttons and import buttons. So if you just want to have import only or export only, you could, instead of including this buttons from configuration, include one of those templates. And inside, it's the information, how to process some information and display the button if you have export allowed. Okay, so what is this alias for? And okay, so IDE again, and we go to those import to export YAML. Excuse me. So here you can see we have some fixtures, we have converters, we have export processors, strategies, import processors, and the important one is here is called configuration provider. So we create some configuration provider. We always tag it with the arrow import export configuration, and we create an alias for it. Okay, so this alias is the alias used here. Excuse me, in the tweak. So whenever we include this template with the alias, he will be looking for the service tagged with the configuration provider with the specific alias. And then inside this configuration provider, we return the import export configuration object with all the processors that should be used. So we created the services there. And as you remember, each service also had an alias. So import export processor, we have the type, class, and the alias. Okay. And here in the configuration provider, we put all of those together. So we set the class for the export. We set which export processor alias should be used. So he knows that he will need to look for the import export tag with the type export processor for the export and with the specific alias, right? So we configure all of those together, and that's it. Thanks to this, in the tweak, we only use the alias of the configuration provider, and that's it. We do not have any logic here. You could still use this old approach with buttons HTML tweak, but then all the information about the specific processor being used was in the template itself. So it's just different encapsulation. And of course, it's better to have this configuration provider. It's easier to modify it. You don't have to modify the template. So this is the recommended approach. And what are the potential issues of using the import-export? First of all, not only issues, but what a potential request. I need to use custom data format. You have to think what is custom, if this is different conversion, or you serialize the object different way, or it's just a different way how you approach the storing the information to database. So you can change the data converter, serializer, or the strategy, or even the whole processor. For example, if you have something very simple, like simple CSV import, you don't need any relation, don't need any normalization. In this case, you could create your processor that will not be calling converter, serializer, or strategy, and it will just process the data. So you remember the step have the reader, processor, and the writer. So you can change each of those services separately. So if you change only the processor, the process method will still receive one record from the reader and should just return one record for the writer. But if this is like very simple logic and you don't want to use all this or watermark we have, you just create your custom processor, create the process method inside, tag it accordingly, and do whatever you would like to do with your data inside this processor method. Okay, so there are cases that this can be overcomplicated or just too much for your needs. In such a case, you can just override the processor and skip all this data conversion, serializing, and strategy. Also, if this is like initial import and the performance, for example, it's just too slow, you can work directly with DBOL instead of ORM, and then just need to, check the data source if there is, and think about escaping data by yourself. Some best practices. If you need to import small amount of entities, like from 5 to 50 Ks, Oro has built-in CSV import for most of the entities, and this is just good enough. You run it with the default values, and that's it. If you need to run it only once, from my experience, there is nothing that is only once. It seems like only once, but then, hey, we already have it, let's reuse it. So you should never think when you code about using it only once. You should always think, yeah, probably it will be reused later on. But if this is a specific case, you can just create a comment that will import those entities, and without using import export bundle, because as you saw, this import export bundle, it really have a lot of functionalities, but it's also quite many things to configure to make it work. That's what I said, that if you would like to import new export processor and you are not planning to reuse the existing converters, you can put all the logic inside the processor instead of using all those services. But this is if this is like very simple import or export. If you are using custom import, please remember a validation of entities. So as you remember, validation YAML is used automatically in the forms, but you always can use the validator interface and then call validate, pass the object, and he will validate this object against its class validation. And this is actually, we're gonna see in the practice in a second. The standard configurable import-export is very simple to set, and it will work for scalar fields and simple relation just fine. So you will see that it's just a few services and some configuration, and you will have import-export up and running. Also, we didn't cover, but I think there is a link. Just a second. Okay, I will find the link in a second. There is quite good documentary about all the events that are being called inside the services of import-export. Let me just quickly check. I think it was for the, just a second, guys. Oh yeah, actually, I was looking at the correct link. So it's here. And here you have all the information about import-export, and important part to understand the whole abstract is here, import process in detail. So this is what I try to explain. So how you process the information step by step from which service to another, and the same export process in detail. So if you need to memorize it again or read it to understand it, is very good article. And also next one is the events. And as you will see in the default process, there is a lot of events. So you have the events for the normalizations, you have the events for the headers, for the fixtures, then you have the events for the data conversion, and as always, we have events before and after the execution, and then you also have events for the strategy. So you can do something before or after the import strategy. So really the default classes, default process is highly customizable. And okay, I will show you the practice right now, and then we'll have question and answers for both the theory and the practice, and that will be it for today. Okay, there we go. and the practice session. So we should add simple import and export for user naming type. It should be available from the index page. We should use default data converter, serialize the strategy. And we should use this recommended approach, so buttons from configuration tweak template. Optionally, but it's so actually just to answer your question, because I never explained why this is optional. So optional means that you could skip this part and proceed to the next practice of the training. So it will be not required to go on with the another practice session without implementing this one. But that's only why it's optional. And add user naming type entity validation and add import template. So let's start from this one, user naming type entity. So we go to the IDE. We could start from entity configuration. So let's collapse all of those, and we have the entity. And we start by adding those config fields, after which we execute command to load the config. So we set the ID order and just order for the entities. That's it. So we have ID, title, format, properties. We just set the ID for import export, sorry, the order. Very, very basic one. Then we could create this import export YAML. If you do, please remember about loading it in the dependency injection extension. Excuse me. And then we have the services. In 90% of the cases, you don't need auto wiring for this, because you will be using a lot of parent definitions here. So for the converter, both the data converter and the template data converter, we just create the instance that initializes the parent service, because as I remember, it is abstract. Okay, so we cannot just use the data converter configurable. We need to create our own service that will extend it, and that's it, because the configurable is abstract. Then we do the same for the strategy. So we have the converter and we have the strategy created, so we just need the names for it. Then we have the processor. For the export, we have two in this case. So one is the export, one is the export template. So we set the data converter. In this case, it's just to show you that it can be different for those. And it's important to tag it. So we have the ORO import export processor. Then we have the type. We have the specific entity it's exporting. And we have the alias. The alias can be the same for the export and export template, because as you remembered in this configuration provider, we had different keys. So he will anyway look for the type and then for the alias. So for different types, the alias can be the same. If you would have two processors of the same type, like for example, for the import, so in the contact configuration, then those would have different alias. And then we have the import processor. As you can see here, we can reuse one, just providing two tags. So this processor will be used in both import and import validation. And for it, we are setting data converter and the strategy. Strategy is just the default one being used. We have all the services. So to put them together, we need to create this configuration provider. Important one is to tag it with the alias, for example, training user naming. And inside we create the configuration object and pass the keys. So actually, let's go to this. Here you have all the keys you can pass. So we pass the entity class. This is like the quiet one. We have the export processor, export template, and import processors. For the export and export template, usually you just set its alias using the name of the entity. For the import, usually you join it with the strategy, because you can have many strategies. And right now, I know exactly that this is training user naming, add or replace strategy. So once I have this, this is tagged properly with an alias, I can add it to the index page. So I go to the template, include this template in the button, and provide the alias for this configuration provider service. Okay, that's it. If I did it properly, of course, if I will be doing this, I'll be doing this step by step. So I will start from one processor, check if it works, add another one, and so on and so on. Once I've done this, I will go to the application. And here I have the buttons. Okay, so I can export it and I should receive the email. Yeah, it was exported successfully. And the same, I can export the template. Oh, actually, I didn't show you how to create a template yet. But if I would export template, I should receive the CSV file. Oh, where is my, okay, it's here. And as you can see, it's very simple template. I have some ID, I have title and the format, and that's it, because it's a very simple entity. So how to create this template? I would create the tag for template, export template. And here as was we have the comment auto wiring could be used. And for the template, what is important, I set the entity class, I say some key, and here I populate the entity with some dummy data, okay? So I do not use any real objects from database. I create this in this fixture file. So I set the title, I set the format. You should never export the real data in the export template. And as I remember, yeah, that's it. Oh, the validation. So validation is going to be checked during the import export. So this is how I create the validation. I have the resources, not in the OR, just in the config directory. I have the validation YAM, Symfony validation. I have the class name. Then I have the properties. I would also use constraint here if I have any class constraint. But as I do not have any class specific constraint, only the properties, I go with the properties. And I have the title and then the list of the constraint. So it should not be blank and the length should be maximum 64. And then I have the format, again, should not be blank and the length should be maximum 255. So let's try to break those rules. For this, usually I would open the template and I would like to create new format, let's say just surname. Okay. And here, or just the last name to keep the naming properly, I would not provide any naming format. I store it as a CSV, and I will try to import this. First, I can, of course, validate. So I pick the file, I can validate it. A message queue is running. This is important. It will not do anything if this is not. And I have errors. If I have errors, there is an error log. I can open, just remember about the environment. Oh, actually, it was already built. Okay, I have error in row 1, so it tells me which row of the CSV is incorrect. And naming format, this value should not be blank. Okay, so this is correct. If I would import the entity, he will throw me the errors. But of course, it's better to validate the file than just import it straightforward. So here, I just can paste the format again. And I only want to use last name, right? So the format will be last. I store it. I can validate again. I click validate. There is a new email. It was processed and no errors, so I can import it now. Import file. Okay, 0 errors, processed one, read one, added one. That's correct. We created new naming type, so it should be added. So if I refresh now, I can see there is a new one. If I would have sockets configured, it will tell me that the import-export was finished. So I have just the last name and the format is correct. Example was generated. Okay, that's it, guys. And now questions and answers. So do you have any questions? This is important one. You will have import and export on every project you're gonna do in Euro. So do you have any questions about it? Let me check also the Slack channel. Okay, guys, I see there is no question. Abhishek, you're asking about the services decoration. So yeah, you should retag it. Whenever you override or decorate the service, you should include the original tags with the decoration service decorator. And also Marius, does 4.1 have a build e-product price list import? Um, Let me check, but as I remember, the price list import is always there. Sorry. Demo products price lists. And here you can import and export the prices. Now, import products for multiple price lists. No, we always import prices for the price list. The other way, I don't think this is like out of the box. Please also post this question to the Slack and I will find out if this is possible or if you have any plans to go with it. Okay, guys, looks like there is no more questions. So, oh, there is one more in the Slack. Is it possible to add extra columns in a CSV export? Yeah, Oscar, you would have to add some additional logic to this data converter or to the normalizer. It depends what are those columns, and then you could go. So, as I understand, there should not be entity columns, because if those are entity columns, you just configure them to be exportable. If those are like additional columns, it will be custom feature. Alex, sorry, maybe I've missed, but is it possible to import multi-layer, like data with the relations from XML or JSON? By default, you have imports from CSV, and also there is a quite very good question. Thank you for this, because here you have something like postponing rows. And please take a look at this. And for example, if you would like to import the structure of the customers and there is a parent-child relation, and for example, we are importing the child before importing the parent, you can have some logic, and then the row could be postponed, and then it will be imported again. We use this by default for the category import. So you can start looking there how you can go with it. So for example, we imported 3 of the categories, and if the category is important before its parent category was imported, it will be postponed. So this is answer for your question, Alex. You can use this functionality. Marius, I am really sorry, my question was a bit incorrect. Does 4.1 support import of price list? You can import prices for the price list. So you just open the price list and then inside you import the prices for it. You don't import like the whole price list. You can create it and then import the prices inside. Is this what you're asking for, Marius? Is this the answer you're looking for? Okay, so please try again. So you cannot go to the product and import prices there. You always import prices for the price list. So you go to the price list and then you import the prices. Marius, if this is not answering a question, please post it to the Slack. Again, you have the link, but I will also add it to the chat. Oh, it is in the chat. So this one again, and we can continue there, okay? And for the price list itself and about dynamic price generation, you will have really good coverage on the commerce webinar. So probably you will have more answers there, okay? All right, guys, I think there is no more questions. So thank you very much for joining. Tomorrow, we're going to have 3 topics to cover. So we're going to talk about the API, about the integrations, and about the message queue. And then Friday, we're going to talk about the workflows. And we have longer question and answer sessions. So please prepare some questions if you have. Christian Murray, when is commerce webinar? As I remember, it will be next week. Okay. Thank you very much, guys, for joining, and talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.